Voyagers. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all well. In this video we are going to be reviewing Voyagers, which is a science fiction thriller movie that is dubbed Lord of the Flies but in space, which has so much potential, and it does explore really interesting themes including fear, power, abuse, jealousy. I just feel like they could have pushed it so much further, as it's just got such an intriguing premise. And like I said, they do explore really interesting aspects within this film. They just could have taken it a lot further, and I'm going to be breaking it all down for you in this movie review. So the basic premise of this movie is that mankind is about to go extinct due to climate change, so they arrange for 30 young kids to take an 86-year-long journey to another planet so that they can repopulate that planet. Aboard the spaceship to the planet, the kids unknowingly take a liquid drug which suppresses their emotions and their desires. When they discover this, they begin to stop taking this drug, which kicks in their primitive emotions, and they then begin turning on each other, and the film then explores what's going to happen next. So from a positives point of view, this movie is really interesting as it explores really interesting themes, as Lord of the Flies does, but in this movie they definitely do it from a space perspective, such as the descendants from order into chaos. The power struggles between different characters is super interesting in this movie in terms of people's desire and jealousy to take power from other characters and then to rule other people by fear. I thought it was really, really interesting. Also, once you've descended into a bit of a negative spiral, can you get out of that and return to normality, and what are the things that you have to do in order to do that? And there are loads of intense moments in this movie as well. However, like I said before, I just feel like they could have just done so much more with this premise. Even tribalism, I feel like that's an interesting concept. They do touch on it, but I just feel like they could have explored that aspect a little bit further in terms of there being different groups and how are the different forms going to be successful when they've got such opposing different beliefs and different views, which I think is really, really interesting. And also they just could have built up certain characters and certain relationships so that when they do descend into chaos, it really does have an emotional impact on the viewer. But that being said, I feel like from a storyline point of view, this movie is pretty solid. So from a cast and characters point of view, this movie is actually pretty wicked, as they've got a brilliant cast and they play all of their characters really, really well. So let's go through them one by one. So first up we have the awesome Tye Sheridan, who is playing the Christopher character. He is the first one to discover that the blue liquid that all of the characters are taking is actually a bit of an unknown drug that is suppressing people's emotions. And I think this is a really interesting moral question in terms of he's discovered this information, and does he disclose it to everybody else, as it will inevitably have a bit of a negative impact on him, which it does. So I just feel like this aspect was pretty interesting in terms of, do you keep certain information for yourself or do you disclose it to everybody else? In terms of this character specifically, he represents order and control and definitely wants to keep the way in which things used to be before. Next up we have Fionn Whitehead, who is playing the opposite character, who is Zach. And I think it's really interesting how in the beginning these two characters were actually best friends, but then they had totally different views and were very destructive for the survival of the entire group. This character definitely represents toxic masculinity to a T, as he definitely rules by fear. He's a very ruthless character, no care for anybody else apart from his own selfish desires. He's a very abusive character, gets very jealous and is just constantly desperate for power, and will also intimidate and abuse other characters as well. Next up we have Colin Farrell, who is playing the Richard character, who at first is a little bit of a parental figure, and then you discover that he is the person that is giving all of the blue liquid controlling drug to everybody else, who's obviously doing it as he wants to keep the peace across the 86-year-long journey. And I guess it's a really interesting moral question about whether or not what this character is doing is right or wrong. And then finally we have Lily Rose Depp, who is playing the Seller character, and I think this is a really interesting look at society, as all of the three main male leads are really desiring the Seller character, which I think is a really interesting social commentary on society at large. And so from a cast and characters point of view, I think this movie is actually pretty awesome. So the visuals in this movie are pretty decent. You definitely feel like you're in a spaceship and that you're aboard this flight with all of these different characters on this 86-year-long journey to another planet. The ship itself feels very cramped, very narrow, and some of the set pieces do feel a little bit repetitive. But it does what it needs to do. Similarly to the plot, I do feel like they could have explored and expanded upon this a little bit further, but you know, like I said, it does do its job from a visuals point of view. So from a comparison point of view, you know, like I said before, this movie is obviously based on Lord of the Flies, and I studied Lord of the Flies in English literature, so I know that book inside out in terms of all of its symbolism, all of its representations on society, and all of the many themes that are communicated in that book. And you know, they do touch on it in this movie. I just feel like by comparison, Lord of the Flies just really delves into it so much further. I think it's also really interesting in terms of dystopian future-based movies like The Giver, Brave New World, the TV series, and The Island as well. They all have their own version of a suppressing drug which is going to be controlling people and wiping out their emotions, which I think is super interesting in terms of commentary for society at large. But you know, from a comparison point of view, whilst it's not as strong as the source material that is based upon, it's still really interesting in terms of looking at society at large. So overall, I really enjoyed Voyagers. I think it's such an interesting movie and a really interesting depiction on society as well. What is going to happen to characters when you wipe out different rules and controls, and how will they use this in terms of competing with one another for power and for control, and will they descend into chaos, or will they work well as a team in order to push through? And so I think it's really, really interesting. A little bit similar actually, now that I think of it, to The Purge as well, about what will people do when they have no restrictions. And so I think it's a really interesting analysis on society at large. Like I said before, I do feel like they could have pushed it a little bit further in terms of really delving in to human behavior, in terms of exploring different themes and character motivations even further. But you know, it is a pretty interesting watch, and so for all of those reasons, I'm going to give Voyagers a solid 5.5 out of 10. I'd love to hear what you think, so please let me know in the comment section below. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in my next video.